man enters a boat with his family to avoid the divine judgment of a flood. After a terrible storm, the boat finally lands safely on a mountain. He sends out birds to determine when it's possible to exit the boat, and after disembarking, he immediately offers a sacrifice. Does that story ring a bell? You're right. It's a story found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Join me today as I tell the story of this ancient saga, show its many similarities to the Bible, and explain why it all matters. Hi everyone, this is Daniel McCabe, Executive Director of Shalom Y'all Ministries. Our Associate Director Adam Keim is not with me today, and so we'll just go solo in this discussion of the Bible and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Adam and I write 3 or 4 times weekly. We write on Facebook, we post there, and we also release these to Substack, where our account name is Shalom Y'all Ministries. So you can always keep in touch with us, even between our monthly podcasts, and I hope you're able to do that. Well, this week I want to begin, as I love to do, with a short trivia question. This one is about life in the land of Israel today. There's a lot the Bible says about how the Jews would bury their loved ones in the Bible. Very unique ways they did that in the first century. But today, when do Jews bury the deceased? Here's your 3 choices. When do the Jews bury the deceased? Do they bury them 8 days following their death? Do they bury them on the 1-year anniversary of their death? Or do they usually bury them the very same day? When do Jews bury their deceased? 8 days later only, or on the 1-year anniversary rather, or usually the very same day? Think that one over and we'll have the answer for you later in the podcast. Let's begin just right off the bat with the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. You know, we've all lost a friend whose death hit us hard. I've had that in the course of my lifetime. Paul McCartney lost John Lennon. David lost Jonathan. And Gilgamesh lost Enkidu. You know, despite his semi-divine birth, the power of the throne, and his unrivaled physical strength, the death of his dear friend suddenly brought young King Gilgamesh face to face with his own mortality, and subsequently led him on a quest to find eternal life. In his travels, Gilgamesh learns of Utnapishtim, sometimes called the Babylonian Noah, who, along with his wife, are the only humans to have been granted immortality by the gods. So Gilgamesh, he undertakes a long, treacherous journey from his home in the Mesopotamian city of Uruk, through darkness, across mountains, and over dangerous seas to the home of Utnapishtim, who explains to Gilgamesh how he received immortality as a reward for obediently constructing an ark at the god's instruction, and for surviving the floods sent by them to destroy all mankind because, well, at least in one version, because man had disturbed the god's rest by making too much noise. Well, written in Akkadian cuneiform on 12 clay tablets, the Epic of Gilgamesh bears some striking parallels to the biblical flood story, and along with hundreds of other flood stories from different cultures throughout the world. It reinforced by its story support for the Bible's claim of a universal flood. That's what makes it such a powerful testimony to the past. Now, portions of the 12 tablets were unearthed in the excavation of King Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh from 1849 to 1851. And then the tablets were later transported to the British Museum. They were cataloged and stored in its basement, where they remained essentially unread until 1872, when a young employee named George Smith dedicated himself to that arduous task. Now imagine his surprise and joy when his eyes caught these words from Tablet 11, which read, "The ship rested on the mountains of Nazir," end quote. Now, this discovery in particular motivated him to return to Nineveh to search among the thousands of fragments still uncovered there for any remaining portions of the epic. And most remarkable than finding a needle in a haystack, Smith succeeded. But why are we taking such a deep dive into the Epic of Gilgamesh when it's very possible that you're fighting a yawn or perhaps thinking that right now might be a good time to rearrange your sock drawer? Well, first, as I just mentioned, the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of hundreds of extant flood stories found among diverse cultures worldwide. It's including Jewish, Mesopotamian, Greek, and Indian cultures, and each one of them contributes to the rising tide of evidence for an ancient flood. Now, it's true, the stories vary widely on the details, but that's to be expected as each culture is going to put its own interpretive spin and flourishings on it. But for me, the biblical account of the flood rings the truest. But even if one found another flood tradition more compelling, it would be no light task to dismiss the historicity of an ancient flood outright, given the widespread literary support for it across so many cultures. Then, second, perhaps justly described as the crown jewel of all flood stories outside of the Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a worldwide flood when it uses expressions like this, where it says, quote, all mankind had turned to clay, and I looked out over the sea, and the whole of mankind was destroyed, and all living beings were destroyed, end quote. Now, the Bible's description of a worldwide flood has often been dismissed by historians as either an exaggeration or is merely an example of the literary use of universal language. Historians insist, well, they argue instead in favor of a regional flood. But the Bible finds support for a worldwide flood, I think, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there's no compelling reason to take these descriptions at less than face value as far as I'm concerned. Third, there are striking similarities in both accounts, both the Epic and the Bible, which might suggest that one borrowed from the other, but it might just as readily suggest that they both correctly captured key details of the actual historical event. And I think that's what happened. And I'll examine these similarities in just a second. But then finally, although the Epic of Gilgamesh predates the book of Genesis by a few hundred years, with Genesis dating to 1400 BC or so, and the Babylonian epic to as early as 1800 BC, both reflect the language and imagery of ancient Near Eastern culture, which helps us make better sense of certain parts of their accounts, such as boat construction, indigenous animal life, and sacrificial practices. So there's a lot of reasons to examine the Epic of Gilgamesh alongside the Bible for so many times we can look at these stories in history and wonder if there is any corroboration with the Bible, and there is so much in this case that we can show to be parallel with the Bible, and there's good reasons to study it. It's after all the most striking of all flood stories outside of the Bible, and as promised, I want to list some of these similarities between this ancient Babylonian account and that found in the book of Genesis. I think it's perhaps safe to say that there are some differences between the two accounts. Of course, there probably are more differences than similarities, but we should expect at least some similarities between them if we're to contend that they independently reflect the knowledge of an ancient global flood, as I do. And in fact, there are substantial similarities. So let's take a look at five of them, maybe even more. I think we'll even go deeper than that. So, first of all, the flood is divinely planned in both accounts. Like in the Babylonian account, for example, the gods decree the flood, though admittedly, Ishtar later lamented the decision after witnessing the terrible destruction that resulted from it. And then Genesis 6:17, it attributes the flood as well to divine intervention when it reads, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth, though of course here it's the decision of God alone. Then, secondly, the impending flood is revealed to a heroic man in both accounts, the Bible and the Epic of Gilgamesh. So, Ea, E-A is how his name is spelled. We'll just use that pronunciation. Ea, the Babylonian god of wisdom, he informs Utnapishtim of the coming flood in a dream. So there's that. And then God tells the godly Noah directly in Genesis chapter 6 and verses 9 and 13. Then, thirdly, the reason for the floods, the moral failure of man in both accounts. The Babylonian account records Ea as justifying the flood with these words, quote, "On the sinner lay his sin, on the transgressor lay his transgressions." That would be tablet 11, line 180. And then in Genesis 6, 5, and 12, God intends to punish sinful man for his wickedness and violence. Fourthly, the hero is instructed to build a boat in both accounts. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's variously referred to as a ship or boat, and even once as a house or palace, suggesting its considerable size. In Genesis 6:14, Noah is instructed to build an ark, which usually in the Bible meant a chest, a box, coffin rather than a ship. So choosing the word ark highlighted sort of its peculiar design, unlike that of a typical ship. It's the same word commonly used, for example, for the Ark of the Covenant. And also in both accounts, the vessel had multiple levels, a door and at least one window, and they were both made watertight with pitch. So there's some significant similarities there. And then fifthly, the physical conditions of the flood are described in both accounts. The Babylonian account tells of a destructive wind and a torrential rainstorm with lightning and thunder, as well as the breaking of dikes, reservoirs. For example, the full account in Genesis describes a violent downpour as well as catastrophic changes in the Earth's atmosphere and climate and even subterranean geology. So there's similarities there. And then, yeah, let's look at some more. For example, the duration of the flood is given in both accounts. In the Babylonian account, the storm lasted just 6 days and nights, and the flood ceased on the seventh day. No mention is made of the length of time that Utnapishtim and the others remained inside the boat. In the Genesis account, it's much longer. It describes a violent downpour of 40 days and 40 nights in Genesis 7:12, and ordinary rain upheaval continued for 5 months. Chapter 8 tells us that. The entire flood event looks to have lasted for roughly 1 year, but both it specifically tells us the duration. And then let's see, seventh, the landing place of the boat is given. Utnapishtim's vessel grounded on Mount Nasir. It's a site commonly identified with Pir Omar Gudrun, which is located about 400 miles north of the Persian Gulf in the Kurdish region of modern Iraq that's east of the Tigris River. Noah's Ark rested on the mountains of Ararat, Genesis 8:4, general region located west of the Caspian Sea, if you know that area, and southeast of the Black Sea in Armenia, very near the borders of Iran and Turkey. Eighth, birds are sent out to assess the level of the water. In the Babylonian account, a dove, a swallow, and a raven are all released consecutively on the seventh day. The dove and the swallow return, the raven doesn't. This bears a striking resemblance to the biblical account, in which Noah first releases a raven 40 days after the tops of the mountains become visible, and then a dove on 3 subsequent occasions until finally feeling confident that the water had abated. There's no mention of a swallow, however. Still, considerable overlap there. Ninth, the hero and his family are delivered in both accounts. In addition to all living animals, Utnapishtim survives the flood with his immediate family, his extended family, a number of important craftsmen, and the boat pilot. 8 people exit the ark in the biblical account, which includes, of course, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. That's Genesis 6. You can even see that in 1 Peter 3. Then 10th, the hero worships after disembarking. As I said in my introduction, Utnapishtim pours out a drink offering and burns a fragrant sacrifice of sweet cane, cedar, and myrtle to the gods who are drawn to the sacrifice. It says, like flies. Noah, on the other hand, he offers numerous burnt offerings to the Lord who smelled, quote, the soothing aroma, Genesis 8, 20 and 21. And then finally, here's an 11th similarity in both accounts. The hero is blessed. Utnapishtim and his wife received divinity and immortality. Likewise, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, Noah doesn't receive immortality, but it clearly notes that, I guess, that God blessed Noah and his sons. They would be fruitful, they were granted permission to eat meat, and they became recipients of a covenant with God that promised no more global flooding. That's in verses 11 through 17. So both of the heroes did receive blessing. So you can see, to me, the many similarities between these two ancient flood traditions suggest that both had independent knowledge of a global flood. Now, before I kind of wrap things up a little bit, let me mention two other early flood accounts. I mentioned there are hundreds, and there are. Now, of course, we all quickly recognize the name Noah as the godly man who built an ark at God's instruction in order to survive the global flood that Moses records in the book of Genesis. And by now you've learned the name Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah. Some people may say it quite differently from the way I'm pronouncing it. That's my best attempt at it. He's the main hero of the Babylonian flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh, of course. But do you know the names Atrahasis and Ziusudra? Well, those are names that until recently weren't all that familiar to me either. Atrahasis is the hero of an even earlier Babylonian flood account, which was probably written in a similar dialect of Akkadian, which is the ancient language of the region. And then in later Babylonian tradition, Atrahasis is even identified as Utnapishtim. So clearly the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh borrowed and revised the even earlier Epic of Atrahasis. And then there's a story of Ziusudra, fittingly called the Sumerian Noah. He predates both Babylonian epics and records the flood tradition of the ancient region of Sumer. Ziusudra is a king priest from the important Sumerian city of Shuruppak, located on the Euphrates River near the city of Ur. That's the hometown of Abraham. You'll recognize that. Now, inscribed on clay tablets or clay fragments that date to approximately 2000 BC, the Sumerian account, the earliest flood story ever recorded, it's albeit incomplete. It agrees with both the biblical and Babylonian accounts on several core elements, including a divine warning which precedes the flood, the necessary construction of a vessel, and the destruction of mankind outside the vessel. Like Utnapishtim, Ziusudra is even awarded with immortality. So these flood traditions are just three of the hundreds of ancient flood traditions that anthropologists have identified worldwide, and they surely seem to corroborate the history of the flood. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh, you can read that largely intact. The other flood accounts are more fragmentary and more difficult to just sort of sit down and read from beginning to end. But you can find copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh online. You might want to take a look. But I just find the similarities fascinating. I'm not the first one that has. There is so much criticism of the Bible these days, saying that it's not true in recording a global flood, for example, and it's ridiculous, almost comical, the way the Bible describes it. But when we see some of these ancient stories that say some things very similar, I think that should give us confidence if we needed any. I mean, my confidence is strong in the Word of God, but give us confidence that there's other evidence that can support and reinforced despite what others might suggest. So hope you found it interesting. Adam and I thought we would just maybe do a little change of pace and cover that today. And hope you just, again, do find your confidence in the Bible growing more and more as we study things like this, other archaeological finds in our podcast. But check out also, too, again, as I said earlier, I think, check out our Facebook or Shalom Y'all Ministries there, and our Substack account at Shalom Y'all Ministries as well. And you can go back and read things that we've posted in the past. You can even go to our website, shalomyallministries.org, which has hundreds and hundreds of backstories in our archives page rather. So anyway, take a look and maybe even send us an email at shalomyallministries@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Well, we've been watching events in the Middle East with Iran, and things are very tense these days. But even so, even now, it might be a good idea to consider planning a future trip. I think this conflict will pass, maybe even pass quicker than we know. And whether or not we are going to be able to go in May as we hope may not be the case. But if you're thinking about going to the land of Israel, why don't you contact us at the email address I just gave you, shalomyallministries@gmail.com. Just let us know of your interest, and perhaps we can plan a trip for you. We'd love to do that. And hopefully, again, things will settle down. There will be maybe a regional peace like never before. We're looking forward to hearing some good news out of the Middle East these days. Well, let's quickly just return to our trivia question before I let you go. But earlier I asked a question a little bit about some of the ritual and the practices of Jews today with regard to their loved ones. And I asked, when do Jews bury the deceased? And I asked, is it 8 days later on the 1-year anniversary, or usually the very same day? And in Israel today, they do bury their loved ones on the very same day. They'll bury them, and then later they'll go back and they'll add a headstone and have a time where everybody gathers for some type of a service. It's not probably quite as hard for people to gather in Israel, being a much smaller country, than it would be for us. But it works for them. It's a good practice. In Bible days, they would often bury the dead on the very same day, and then on the anniversary of that death, they would go back and they would collect the bones of their loved one that had over the years just decomposed inside the tomb. And then during biblical days, there was an unusual practice where they used ossuaries. It's a bone box. This happened during the first century in Jesus' day. They used this. This is one way we can kind of date tombs to the time of Jesus. And they would put the bones in these ossuaries and collect them. And so there's some very unusual practices that the Jews have, but some of the ancient practices have even carried over to today. And the burial the very same day is one. It's an ancient practice and also a modern practice. Maybe you can find that interesting. Well, again, we miss Adam whenever he's not here, but hopefully he can join us next month. We'd love to have you join us as well. But until next month, I wish you great peace wherever you're at. And as we classically close, I'll just wish you a peace in Hebrew. Shalom, y'all.